Okay, now let me get back to Canva. Okay, so let's recap from last week. So last week we talked about how attachment wounds affect relationships. We talked about our threat and our attachment systems and how they ideally should be operating independent of each other. But sometimes we have people in our attachment system who are also in our threat system. We also talked about trauma's impact on the nervous system. And then we ended it talking about parasympathetic responses to help calm our nervous system. Anything that stood out to you guys or that you had questions on or want to comment on from last week before we get into this week? Okay, let's just go forward. So I want to ask you this question, and obviously it's probably, what were you going to say, Tara Lee?
Nothing.
Oh. Obviously the answer can be some of both. But when you feel anxious, unworthy, or emotionally overwhelmed, do you move toward yourself? So maybe you get very present and you're very alert. That would be some of that hyper arousal, which would be fight or flee, or moving away from yourself, which is more of a freeze and an appease type of response. So do you guys have one or the other where you're moving towards yourself or away from yourself?
Yeah, I think I move away from myself.
Okay. Okay. What about the other two?
Same here.
Away from. Okay.
Say the other one again, Jackie.
So kind of moving towards yourself where maybe things kind of get really clear. You're in this headspace of, where moving away from yourself, things might get a little bit blurry. You're not quite hearing everything. Moving towards yourself is taking you more towards a fight, maybe preparing to run away if necessary.
That's me.
Okay. Okay. Just some things to be aware of as we're talking about this week. And again, we can do all of these things. And the part of our brain that is detecting the threat and moving into these responses is reacting. Like these are not conscious thoughts. They're not conscious decisions of how we respond. And it's happening very quickly because otherwise we might not be safe. So I want to talk this week about self-abandonment. Self-abandonment is the process of disconnecting from our own needs, wants, emotions, boundaries, and our own voice. Most of the time, we don't even realize we're doing it because it's not a choice that we make consciously. Instead, it's just this survival strategy that is born in childhood. Where does self-abandonment start? It starts with the attachment wounds. So for many of us, it begins in childhood when the people we needed the most were inconsistent, neglectful, unsafe, or simply unable to attune to us. And so instead of developing an internal sense of safety, which would be this felt sense that I can trust myself and the world to hold me, we learned that safety comes from managing others, whether that's their moods, their love, or their approval. So I want to talk about, I'm going to play a video by Dr. Gabor Mate, talking about these two core needs that we have that attachment wounds often get in the way of. Oh, I got to unplug again. Can you guys hear this now? Oh, I'm muted.
I can hear you.
That connection, love.
Yep, I can hear it.
Okay, perfect.
When a child is born, the child has two needs. The first need is for attachment. And attachment is contact, connection, love. Without that, the human child does not survive. Any mammalian child or even an avian child doesn't survive. So that as soon as you get past the level of reptiles, the reptile is hatched, the mother's long gone by then, and the reptile infant either lives or dies, but there's no attachment to a parenting figure. As soon as you get to the level of birds now, the baby bird has to have an attachment with the parents. The parents have to be attached to the baby. Otherwise, the infant simply does not survive. Mammalians even more so, and most so the human, because we're the least developed, the least mature, with the least developed brains, and the most dependent for the longest period of time of any creature in the universe. So our attachment needs are enormous, and they remain important throughout lifetime because we have to have attachments to form societies, social groups, without which we don't survive. So attachment is a huge need. We have to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. That's just a basic human need. But we have another need as well, which is for authenticity. Authenticity is the capacity, as I said earlier, to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express who we are and manifest who we are in our activities and in our relationships. Now, why is that? Well, think of a human being in the evolutionary period who's not in touch with their body and their gut feelings. How long do they survive out there in the wild? So authenticity is another huge survival need. Great. So far, so good. But what happens to a child where the attachment need is not compatible with the need for authenticity? In other words, if I'm authentic, my parents will reject me. If I feel what I feel and express what I feel and insist on my own truth, my parents can't handle it. And parents convey those messages unconsciously all the time. Not because they mean to, not because they don't love the child, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because they themselves are suppressed or traumatized or hurt or stressed. So I convey that message many times to my children, believe me, without any conscious desire to do so. In fact, it was the very opposite of what I wished to convey. But that they're not acceptable the way they are, with their emotions the way they are, that's the message my kids got when they were small. And most children get that in our society. And what does the child do with that? Well, if I give up my attachment for the sake of authenticity, I lose my relationships on which my life depends. Therefore, there's no question. What becomes suppressed is our authenticity, our emotions. And then we become 25 and 30 or 35, 40, and we don't know who we are. And somebody asks us, what do you feel? You say, I have no idea. And how many times we've all had the experience of having an inkling of a strong gut feeling, but we're ignoring it. We're ignoring it and we get into trouble. Well, that tells us what happened. What happened was that at some point we found out that it was too costly for our attachment relationships to be in touch with our gut feelings. So then it becomes not our first nature, but our second nature to suppress our feelings, to lose touch with ourselves, and to suppress our gut feelings. And then we pay the cost later on in the form of addictions, mental illness, or any range of physical illnesses. But it all began with this tragic conflict that children should never be confronted with, but are all the time, between authenticity on the one hand and attachment on the other. And even as adults, so many people are suffering because they want to be themselves, but they're afraid to be because they know, or at least they fear that if they're themselves, they're going to lose important attachment relationships in their life.
So just to sum up some of what he was talking about, we have these two core needs, attachment and authenticity. Attachment theory teaches us that we're wired to stay connected to our caregivers at all costs. If we do not attach to our caregivers and they attach to us, that is a life or death situation. And as infants and children, we need our caregivers for food, shelter, safety, really for everything. And so what happens when being our full authentic selves threatens that bond? We begin to adapt. So if crying got us punished or ignored, we stopped crying. If anger led to rejection, we swallowed our anger. And if joy made us too much, we learned to dim our light. Authenticity is all about developing the true self. And if it threatens attachment, we will disconnect from parts of ourselves. Not really because we're broken, but because we're wired to survive. And self-abandonment begins as a brilliant survival strategy, but over time, it starts to become a prison and it traps us. When we consistently ignore or override our emotions, our needs, our intuition, our bodies stay in a state of chronic stress. And that stress builds up. It shows up as anxiety, depression. It can show up as digestive issues, addictions, sleep disorders, autoimmune conditions, and even heart disease. When we're disconnected from ourselves, we're more likely to stay in unsafe or harmful relationships because we learned not to trust our gut. We second guess our instincts. We might be in a place of overtaking responsibility. So we see ourselves as, if I had done something different, this wouldn't have happened. So we don't recognize the warning signs of manipulation, coercion, or abuse because we're out of touch with the part of us that says this isn't okay. So I want to put you guys in groups. We'll just go ahead in these groups that we have. Let me see if I can get to my meeting. Let's see. Nope. I guess it show me. You all get to see how great I am at technology. Let me just go back to stop share. Okay, so we're going to go into breakout rooms for, let's see, we have, let's see, 3. Is 15 minutes enough, do you think, for all 3 of you to talk about what came up, whether from that video or just talking about those 2 core needs, the need for attachment and the need for authenticity? It's 15 minutes. Do you feel like enough? That's 5 minutes each.
I think
Sure.
so.
Okay, let's have you guys go there. Okay. We're all back. Let's just talk for a minute about what came up for you guys as you guys were sharing with each other.
I'll start out.
Okay.
I was just talking to Bonnie and Keith initially about, I thought it was really interesting. Sorry, I cannot clear my throat today. That for, I don't know really, it struck me how men particularly are able to be their authentic selves, even from like the youngest ages. They're taught to be a man and to be strong, and boys don't cry, and be tough, and this and this and that. So that is one of the things that struck me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also was just talking about how, I kind of went from myself, abandonment issues, how I always put everyone else first. But then towards the end of the conversation, I noticed that I think in my family, I was always labeled as outspoken, or, well, if someone's going to say it, Tara-Leigh will, or, being much more. And I, by the end of the conversation talking with Keith and Monty, I think I realized I probably have been more authentic than the rest of my family, in my family of origin, especially. And even with people still, neighbors or coworkers or whatever it may be, I still, there's sometimes that I think, God, I kind of would like to be known as, the gentle and sweet and kind, and I'm not, like, I feel like I do have those qualities, but I will speak my mind. I I have always, not always, but I think in most situations, sometimes I bite my tongue, but I think as I look back on my life, I think I have been pretty authentic.
Mm.
I don't, I've been in situations where I probably have been a little fake, especially like with coworkers or stuff where I have felt threatened in losing something, a job or something. But I don't know. I think for me, I'm realizing that as I've gotten older and look back on my life, I think I have faced a lot of backlash from particularly my family for being authentic.
I mean, I think it's interesting too, because you said that you move more towards yourself, which would be some of that authenticity. Maybe at some point as a young girl, it didn't feel like attachment was going to happen for you. And so there was more of that moving towards self and speaking up and saying the things that, were not acceptable in your family or not welcomed in your family. And as an adult, when we're healing that, we may be developing more of that ability to attach and be soft and be gentle when we are safe, because it may not feel safe very often. The attachment piece would equal the safety, and the authentic piece is learning how to speak up and belong to the self and say what you're feeling or thinking or seeing. Thanks for sharing, Tara-Leigh.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Monty or Keith.
Yeah, for me, just kind of thought about how I didn't have the option to, not to be somebody that wasn't going to church and wasn't going to, um, um, I don't know. I wasn't necessarily a bad kid, but I just didn't want to. The whole church thing, the LDS church thing, didn't jive with me from a early age, and I couldn't talk to my parents about that, and I couldn't talk to anybody about that, and had lots of kids in my family, so it was pretty superficial relationships, and everybody was just busy all the time, and so I just learned to be busy all the time and not really figure out myself, you know.
So you can see that you moved more towards attaching and staying safe that way and suppressing authenticity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Monty.
Yeah, what came up for me is I have an older brother and a younger brother that rebelled and kind of were more authentic for themselves. But the way I got my attention and attachment was through like trying to be the good boy and appear like I was doing the right stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, that messed me up. So that's what
Mm-hmm.
came.
Yeah. Well, and even did you say two older brothers?
My one older brother and one younger brother. Yeah.
Okay, okay. I mean, rebellion isn't really authenticity, right? It's just rebellion. So we
Right.
wouldn't necessarily say they were moving towards themselves and developing authenticity,
Yeah.
but they were pushing back against attachment. Attachment wouldn't have felt safe for them, and so they just rebelled.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so some things like if mom or dad say this, we're going to do the opposite, not necessarily coming into ourself and acting from that place.
Yep. That's a good point about that's not really authentic. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is I feel I don't trust people to like me unless I'm serving them or complimenting them or something like that. And that's been really hard because it's not possible. It's really hard to like break through
Mm-hmm.
or even people that are close to me. And for me specifically to like accept anything from someone else and not think they're just trying to manipulate me or they just want something from me.
Mm-hmm.
That worldview is a really good barrier to attachment and connection.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead, Taralee.
Oh, I was just going to say, when he says that, I think of unworthiness, that feeling of, it sounds like to me like he's saying, in order to be liked, I have to be doing something for someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, that just makes me think of that feeling of unworthiness.
Yeah. It looked like Monty agreed when he did the thumbs up.
Yeah, you got it.
And I also think, the whole worthy thing, even when I was in therapy and since, I struggle with it because I must feel not worthy of stuff because I have a lot of issues that way. But at the same time, I have this like, no, I'm worthy. Like I can do this or that or feel this way or that way without, having something to preempt that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I get really that's kind of blurred for me, the whole worthiness thing.
I mean, I think when attachment is not done right, where parents are attaching to their child and the child is attaching to them, but the parent is also encouraging authenticity and encouraging them to be who they are, which is going to be different than parents. So when attachment doesn't really lead to a secure development of self, I mean, you may have some of that authenticity now, Taralee, that you can do hard things, you can figure things out and you can make things work. But the attachment piece still would bring up some unworthiness because we're talking about attachment, I think we're talking about just being valued for being. And that happens really young. That has to predate us being able to maybe perform. And I mean, we will perform in ways that is still authentic to the self. I'm not saying perform in a way where we are adapting to perform, and like Monty was saying, to do things for others or serve others. It's that performing in terms of developing authenticity. But we've already had that being value. That happens really young before we can start to perform. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think with me, there's this, it must just be wounds, trauma, experiences, whatever it may be, that I'm to a point now where, I don't know, maybe it's an unhealthy place to be, which would not surprise me, but I am kind of at a point where I'm like, I don't care. Like, I'm going to do this and I don't care. And it may be because I have gone to extremes that those extremes have been like so much, like with my family and things, that it's like, no matter what I do, there will always be judgment. So I just don't care.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So let's get back into talking about this. Because I think it'll help you make sense of what you're talking about, as well as for you, Keith and Monty. But this is how internal disconnection just becomes a norm, where even if we're developing authenticity, if it's not attached in that security of parents giving us permission to be authentic, and when we are authentic, they are loving us, they are seeing us and validating that, and, you know, commenting positively about who we are, and also there for us in the moments where we're struggling or when we're having difficult emotions, you know. So that may even be like a young child throwing a temper tantrum. If parents can still, they're there in both the good and the bad times, that is giving permission for the child to be authentic. You know, their child isn't isolated when they're upset or having to suppress those negative, what we would think of as negative emotions, but the parents are still loving and being there and connecting to the child in a way that helps to co-regulate. So let's talk about what internal safety is. Internal safety is not about being perfect or healed or never getting triggered. It's about having a place within ourselves that we don't leave, even when things get hard. And that becomes part of the new core self, where we can return to that knowledge of who we are, those feelings of being enough, those feelings of mattering and not being too much and not being not enough. So it means that we can feel a feeling without fearing that it will destroy us. It means that we can know that we need and trust, knowing what we need and trust that that matters. That we can stay with ourselves through the emotional storms, and that we offer ourselves compassion instead of criticism when we fall short. Any thoughts or things you want to talk about when we're switching into internal safety?
I think it's interesting for me. The first three you named, I think I'm great at, but the fourth I am not.
Okay. And again, I think that's where that may be showing up some of those attachment wounds, where when you could move towards yourself, you did get criticism.
Yeah.
And then now that's just become part of your internal voice. Anything with you, Monty or Keith?
Do you have a slide for that?
A slide for,
Or the ones you just listed, like, do you turn towards yourself with compassion, or do you
oh, is it not showing?
criticism?
Oh.
No.
Oh, well, let me get back and share my screen then. Yes, I do.
Oh, great.
I'm probably just not showing
I
it.
missed some
Oh
of them.
yeah, I didn't reshare my screen.
I kind of went
You guys,
unpresent for a moment.
yeah. Okay, yes, okay. Oh, let me go backwards. And backwards. So this is the internal safety slide. Just that internal safety is not about being perfect or healed or never getting triggered, but having that safe place that within ourselves that we don't leave. And that becomes that new core self. Again, can get triggered, but we are not critical of ourselves. So this is the slide. Means we can feel a feeling without fearing that it'll destroy us. Knowing what we need and we're trusting that that matters. Staying with ourselves through emotional storms, and then offering compassion instead of criticism when we fall short.
Yeah, I think so what comes to mind for me is on that last one is there's some video I watched. It said our internal voices at one point in our lives were external voices.
Mm-hmm.
And my inner critic's very critical. It's hard to do something right. And so that's getting better now, but that's definitely something I struggle with. And that know what we need is interesting because from that video Gabor Mate where he said, you're 30 years old, someone asks you, how are you? And you don't know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
That really goes towards if you don't know how you are, how do you know what you need?
Right.
And so, yeah, I can see how this affects attachment.
Yeah. Yeah, because knowing what we need or even what we want, oftentimes there are those messages that we get, like maybe needs might be okay, at least certain needs, but wants is just now being greedy. But when we know who we are and we have developed authenticity, we do know what we need. And we are trusting that it matters, maybe to the people currently in our life, or it matters to me.
And I think it's interesting with Monty that he's talked about how he has been the golden child
Mm-hmm.
and kind of the people pleaser, whatever you want to call it. And now that he is trying to work on these things, he doesn't have those feelings within himself because it was all external. Like the validation that he was getting from whether it was his parents or his,
Mm-hmm.
church or friends or, work or school or whatever, it was all that surface stuff that
Right.
anyone can have. And so I think with him trying to work on that, being self-critical and those things, that he's never had to dig at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with Monty on a lot of that too. Like I felt like I was just, not very present as a people pleaser. I still am. I've never worked on myself really. I've always found projects. I like to build stuff. I've always stayed busy
Mm.
and never really reflected a whole lot. And I think stuff like these workshops, I feel like everybody should do. I feel like it just gets your mind thinking. Like if you don't even know where to go and think about the things, because whether it's lack of education, I feel like a smart person, but when it comes to emotional and all of this that we're doing, I feel like I'm a 3-year-old.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, and I think that, like I said, when he was talking in that video, I don't know how men are not taught to be emotionally present. They're taught from a very young age to, be busy and provide and
Be
all
tough.
the things,
Mhm,
which is
yeah.
awesome stuff. So great. But at the same time, you never are taught those emotional aspects. And like I said in our breakout session with my boys, I've tried to go to do that so much with them. And it's still, I feel like a failure at it because of society. I don't know how. I think boys can develop that, and I think men can develop that. But I think it probably has to happen when, when you guys are at the ages you are and you've had all these life experiences, and whether it's marital problems or problems with work or whatever's happening, it gets to a point where it's like, I have to do something about this. But I think it's hard to go all those years not being able to have that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I
Go
think a
ahead,
lot of
Jim.
men never even get there. I don't think I think about my dad. I don't think he ever, got that to that point. I feel like there has to be a switch in your head that has to click for you to even want to learn and grow. Otherwise, you
Or
just
yeah, or that switch is a crisis
yeah,
that you're forced into.
yep.
And I think that sucks.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I'm going to say, Charlie, I have three sisters too, and they are just as disconnected and disembodied as us three boys, which is interesting. I think women face disembodiment in different ways. They try have to look a certain way, when they're in junior high, they have to behave a certain way, they have to conform and be part of the group, and they get disembodied there too. It
Mhm.
definitely affects us both. And I think pretty equally is how I look at it.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I do think there is more, like, from a young age, you know, we're the reason people go into therapy is typically for emotional help, mental, and of course it affects us physically. But I'm like, when I'm specifically referring to the authenticity that men, like boys, are taught to not be emotional, and girls from a very young age are literally, we're called emotional.
right. I
And
was going to say, women, little girls get to have emotions,
yeah,
but we're not respected for those emotions. We roll our eyes. We talk about, like, oh my gosh, she's so dramatic.
yeah,
So we might have those emotions, but it's not that we get to own them in healthy ways.
Yeah, they're not validated.
Right. Right. And if we start to be too emotional, we're going to get messages that we need to suppress that. We need
right,
to be nice, we need to be kind, we need to be happy. So we'll still get those messages that some feelings are better than others, and some feelings girls just can't get. Like, I think boys are taught that they can be aggressive or they can be angry. Girls are not given those emotions. Or, I mean, they'll get messages if they have those emotions and they demonstrate those emotions. That's not the way girls are supposed to be.
right.
So
And
yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point where not only do we get these messages in our family, but we also get them from the culture that we grow up in and the world.
yeah. And I was mentioning, in our breakout session, it's not just our Utah Mormon Society. I mean, you go to places like India or
Right.
all cultures, and I mean, women, their faces are covered,
Right.
and the man is everything. And so I think it is just hard. I think authenticity is hard from a very young age for both sexes, of course, but particularly when we are supposed to get older and have these emotional connections. Our entire childhood has taught us to disconnect from that in so many cases.
Right. Yes.
But then we get to this age where we're supposed to get married and have a family, and it's like, hey, it's time for connection, and no one knows how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if we're going to be building that internal safety and having a place within ourselves that we never leave, sometimes I will, spend time with clients developing where that is in their body, getting them to picture what it looks like. How do they access it? Do they know where it is? How do they access that? And the tools that are inside of that for them to start to regulate and be able to both create healthy relationships and recognize what is not okay, as well as to come home to self and be safe. I was just thinking, Tara-Leigh, about what you were saying. I love this. I think it's a Ram Dass quote where he talks about like we're all just walking each other home. And I think sometimes that does take us getting to adulthood where we start to recognize that we did not learn or develop the things that we needed to actually live a healthy and happy and satisfying and meaningful life. And so we start to, maybe get help. Now, I think currently, maybe your generation, my generation, I'm Gen X, we're more open to therapy. We're more open to things like this online workshop. Our parents, unfortunately, had a lot of stigma around that. And if they did seek therapy, they probably were not actually talking about things that they had promised themselves they would take to their grave. And we know that they're less likely to go to therapy and stay in therapy. So beginning to build that safety within ourselves, it starts with recognizing patterns. And I have a worksheet that I will send out with the video because there's more that we can get to than just I think I'm covering 2 in this last half of the workshop. So it starts with recognizing patterns. When we're going to heal from self-abandonment and build internal safety, it's a layered process, and it will include several pieces. One of the first is recognizing the pattern. We can't heal what we don't see and recognize. So start noticing when and how you leave yourself. Start noticing how you come into yourself, because if we're coming in through anger or we're preparing to flee, that may not be, or we're coming just into ourselves with a lot of dysregulated emotions, that may not be coming from that place of internal safety and knowledge. So it might be subtle, a tensing in your body, maybe when you say yes out of obligation, or a voice in your head saying, don't be dramatic. It might be that anger, and we're speaking way too with a tone that is diminishing actually what we're saying. We may be right on, but we're diminishing ourselves with the way that we're saying it because we're in some of that fight mode. So we might have that habit of seeking reassurance instead of a feeling of self-trust. So when you're triggered, what do you typically do with your feelings? Do you dismiss them? Do you deny them? Do they get big? Or do you disconnect? You can just quickly answer that.
Yeah, I think I disconnect.
Okay.
Mine get really big.
Okay.
Yeah, mine get big. They come out sideways, like want to I get in threat mode.
Okay. So saying that they come out sideways, Monty, do you think that you're in some ways denying them and that's where they come out sideways? Or
No.
you're trying to dismiss them, but they come out sideways?
They're hard to control. Like one of the ways they might come out sideways is I'll start speaking very distinct and specific words, at a time rather
Okay.
than flowing. Eh, Because it feels like half my brain is taken up by trying to manage these emotions and keep it under control, and the other half is trying to express itself, um, and it feels unsafe. So it's hard to get the words out.
Uh-huh. So is part of you trying to suppress and the other part is trying to express?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
That sounds like a battle, Monty.
Oh, it is my whole life, Keith.
A second skill that we can start to develop that is in our toolbox of internal safety is reclaiming your emotional landscape. So what this means is that you get to have your feelings. You get to have all of them. And this is something usually that we're not given permission to do. Whether we claimed the right to have our feelings and to have all of them, but our family or specifically our parents and then maybe our siblings followed along, being critical of us having all of our feelings and expressing them. The goal isn't in reclaiming your emotional landscape. The goal isn't to fix them or to explain them away. It's really to let them live in you without shame. Now, sometimes that might mean, like I know for me, if I get angry about something, I can let that live in me, but I'm not initially when I'm feeling the anger, that's not usually when I'm going to start speaking. Now that might be 10 minutes later. It might be the next day that I circle back and respond to a text. So I have to know when can I connect to that internal safety in me and then maybe speak with a firm voice or speak with a surety or be articulate in what I'm trying to speak to. But I can give myself some time with that emotion so that when I'm expressing it, especially some of the big feelings, that I'm not just expressing anger without it being somewhat channeled, because that, I think for me, both of my parents had a lot of anger, and I grew up being afraid of my own anger. So I had to be able to claim my anger, but also I didn't want to be like my parents. I didn't want it to come out all messy and violent or abusive. It can be especially hard to claim all of your feelings for those who have avoidant, anxious, and disorganized attachment patterns, because you're typically taught that emotions were dangerous, or they were inconvenient, or they just weren't accepted. Some of you guys have talked about all of those, whether they weren't accepted or dangerous, inconvenient. Monty and Keith, what do you think? Which one was it for you guys? Emotions were dangerous because then it would get in the way of you doing something for others, or just inconvenient? Or would you pick a different word?
I would say inconvenient or burdensome to my
Okay.
specifically,
Okay.
because she was already overwhelmed with 6 kids.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I don't know. I don't know what I am. Like, I don't remember situations or scenarios when I shouldn't have or should have. I don't, I mean, I felt like, I don't know, I felt supported, but the more I learn about how you know, the more I learn, the more I think about specific things. I just feel like that there's just too much going on for validation or support.
Mhm.
I don't really know though, as far as like why I'm so not emotional. For the longest time, I blamed it on my on concussions in high school, but I feel like I do have emotion. I don't know. It's just not much.
Mhm. And sometimes we may have different messages that we received around different emotions. So for me, anger always felt dangerous. And that was so true growing up in the family I grew up in. Anger was dangerous. Um, now I know today it doesn't have to be, but it was when I was growing up. And also I could not get angry because I would not be adding to that. Or if I got angry, it was likely to get even worse coming from my mom or dad. So
Are you saying like basically there was anger in the home, and so you guys couldn't have anger because it
yes,
would just compound the situation?
yes, yes.
I got you.
So there was no space for our anger. I don't know that we felt there was a lot of space for any of our anger, or a lot of our emotions. So I would say not just me, but all of my siblings probably have a pretty complex relationship with anger. And when they have got angry, it's not very well channeled.
Yeah.
Um, and so that makes sense to me, but I wouldn't necessarily think that sadness was dangerous. There just wasn't space for it. So just, kind of looking at what are the different emotions and what was okay in my family and what was not okay in my family. Probably some of that you are still living under today. So just talking back to the attachment style. So children with an avoidant attachment style have usually experienced caregivers who rejected or ignored their needs. And these children learn to appear very independent and not to seek help even when they're distressed. Outwardly, they might seem self-reliant, but this is usually a protective posture that's learned because reaching out in the past or needing help in the past just led to disappointment. Children with anxious attachment usually in childhood might have been clingy or hypervigilant to others while feeling very insecure in themselves. They may become people pleasers as early as toddlerhood, crying or behaving in ways that kept the caregiver close and suppressing any of their own needs that might trigger rejection. So in both of these cases, the child's true self doesn't get to mature freely. And instead of exploring their own preferences and their emotions with safety, the child is imprisoned by adaptation, either cutting off their natural needs to avoid pain or constantly monitoring others at the expense of themselves. Does that make sense? Understand what's going on there?
Yeah, I think for me, I thought that I was kind of more anxious, but based on what that just said, it kind of seems like I might just be more avoidant.
I mean, anxiety, this one is probably the anxious, preoccupied attachment, because again, both of them have that anxiety underneath them, the avoidant
Yeah.
and the anxious one. But the avoidant one is much better at suppressing the anxiety that they feel.
Which leads to lack of emotions.
Right, right.
I
Yes.
gotcha.
I'm curious, Keith, with you, and if this is too personal, please forgive me. As I listen to you talk a lot, it sounds like, often when you talk, you'll talk about how you shut down. And I'm wondering if in your, like, with your parents, um, what was the overall, was there a lot of anger in your home or no?
No, I don't think so. I think I think that they were busy, and I think they were. I mean, they got divorced when I was young, and had step parents in and out of the house, you know, throughout the years. And I feel like there was, you know, there was a lot of kids. There was just so much going on. I feel like that there just wasn't room or space for a lot of it.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna take a stab that it doesn't surprise me that there wasn't a lot of anger. I wonder often if you like that disconnect for you is, it reminds me of some things in my own personal life that you just felt lost in the shuffle all the time.
Yeah. Yep.
And sometimes we grow up in homes where parents didn't have a lot of emotions.
Mhm.
And so we just were not around emotions. And the message that we would get from that is that it's better to not have emotions. And so we just don't. I mean,
Yes.
we would say all human beings have emotions. So if they are not there or we are not aware that we have emotions, something happened because we naturally have emotions. We can just learn at very young ages to suppress them.
Yeah, it's interesting to listen to Keith's dynamic for me.
Yeah, I think my parents didn't have emotions either, and that plays into it for sure. On top of the busyness and the lots going on, I feel like, yeah, they weren't supportive emotionally because they weren't emotional people themselves.
Right.
Well, and maybe they also, the bandwidth wasn't there
Yeah,
to
sure.
meet those emotions.
Yeah, I'm sure
Yeah.
that'd be really hard with lots of kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we are learning is that whatever that self-abandonment looked like, whether it was suppressing our need for attachment because that just wasn't helpful to us, and instead we developed authenticity, or we suppressed authenticity in order to stay attached. Either way, it had the self adapting instead of developing. And, you know, like I said before, it was a brilliant strategy at some point. It's just that later in life, as you know, we can be more independent, it starts to cause problems, or we might have people in our life talking about the problems, feeling like, you know, we don't have the emotions, they don't know how to connect with us. I think, Monty, you've mentioned that you didn't know how to trust your wife's love in you, and you felt like she was manipulating you. I think you mentioned that last week.
Yep. Right.
Yeah, so we have to take some time to reinvest in ourselves, to learn how to love ourselves, and to accept that we matter and believe that we matter. When we stop abandoning ourselves, remarkable things can happen. We begin to belong to ourselves, and we start to become the home we were looking for in other people. This happens also for, let's say, in secure families when kids are growing up and parents are there and parents are able to support them in their authenticity while also attaching to them as they go through different stages. What was I just blanked on what I was thinking. I think I might have mentioned this before. We are going to encounter things that can influence our attachment styles out in the world. We're going to encounter relationships that don't go well, whether that's with friends or whether that's with people we had crushes on when we were growing up. And all of that can start to disconnect us from ourselves. I think the thing about secure attachment is that home environment is a secure place. And that makes a difference, even if the outside world is negatively impacting us. Home being a safe place is going to be critical in our development. So when we start to belong to ourselves and we start to become the home that maybe we were looking for in others, again, when we're young, we are dependent on others, feeling like they are safe for us. So we're not born with that feeling of having home inside of us. And it doesn't mean that we still don't long for connection, because we're wired for it. So of course we still long for connection. But now we can start to connect from wholeness and not from neediness. Also, I think, Tara-Leigh, when we have developed authenticity and suppressed our need for attachment, we're also still suppressing our need for connection. And maybe we're not showing up to relationships with neediness, but there would be some insecurity anytime we're interacting with another person or a friendship starts to develop, because that part of ourself did not develop in healthy ways, and we've just kind of discarded our need for connection.
I think it's so funny you just said entirely, because I literally was just going to say, what happens when you just become complacent? Like when you don't even care about, like, I don't even want to text people back, or I'm just like, yeah, I know it's not healthy, but I don't feel like it has outweighed my need for those healthy things. I don't quite get that.
I mean, underneath that would still be some fear and insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And not caring is that protective posture.
Mm-hmm.
So when we stop abandoning ourselves and we start to develop that home within us and that internal safety, we are not performing to feel loved. We're not discarding our need for attachment. We're just showing up as we are, and we are trusting that we are enough.
And what if people have tried to do that with me and I still don't, like, I'll get really far with some situations, like I'll work and work at it, and then I am just done. Like I don't want to continue to try, whether it's romantic partners, or that's probably my main thing in my life right now. I don't know. It's like I'll go through this time period where I'll think that would feel nice or that would be great, and then it's just like I shut it off.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're saying that you'll go a certain, you'll go to certain lengths in romantic relationships, but then you just don't want to try anymore. There is still that feeling underneath there that you're having to try, that it's not just natural, and that you're not just capable, and you're not just opening up yourself naturally or organically. It's I'm having to try. And that gets exhausting, because it's never just that it's there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So even when I am like texting with someone or trying to get together or whatever, and coming up with excuses that I don't want to do anything, what you're saying is even that's not authentic, because I'm having to try too hard.
Or it feels like you're going to have to try too hard at some point, or I will eventually be rejected because attachment didn't happen for me, and who I was criticized. And so that dynamic will happen. So why even start?
That's exactly my whole life right there. In one sentence, it is, this is going to happen, so I'm done trying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, when going back to last week, when we talked about attachment and safety, you guys have had people in your attachment system who were in your threat system. And human beings are imperfect. And so how do we navigate somebody being imperfect and not putting them in our threat system? Just recognizing these are just human imperfections, or this is their own trauma story that got triggered. And it really wasn't them being a threat to me the way my parents were, or the way growing up felt. So again, that becomes tricky to navigate, because we're assuming everybody is, if they're in our attachment system, they are in our threat system. And that feels exhausting. But there is that other third place where it's just human beings being imperfect, or they are acting, this other is acting from their own attachment wounds. But they can get back and they can take accountability for that. They can acknowledge that. They can see that in themselves. They have that insight and they can repair. And so that they never really went into our threat system. It was just that imperfection or their own wounded story. And
Yeah, I
we're
think-
going to do that too. We will act from our wounded story sometimes. What were you going to say, Keith?
I think that's one of the biggest things that I've realized in the past 6 months of starting therapy, and never like even thought about stuff that I thought about in the past 6 months before now, and realizing how everybody's just, you know, you might have a complete view on somebody, and then, the more you think about things, the more you realize that they're just trying to, but they're just being the person that they've grown to be. And
Mm-hmm.
everybody's got their own thing that they've been trying to figure it out. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say we don't want to give them so much permission that we tolerate
yeah,
them being the way that they learn to be.
yeah, there still has to be borders and
Yes, boundaries,
boundaries. Yeah,
and being able to, they have to be able to recognize that, or we can give them some feedback and they can then recognize that and come back to a safe place.
yep,
And this is where accountability becomes really key in, like, I was just thinking of a quote by John Bradshaw where he says, accountability is the guardian of our humanity. So instead of, gaslighting somebody or making them think that, that didn't happen, being able to be accountable and say, yes, this happens sometimes for me when I start to feel insecure or whatever. We start to be accountable. And so we give ourselves permission for this story to still show up sometimes, because it will. The story is there. It happened. We can't undo it entirely.
yeah,
But we can, when it shows up, we can be accountable for it and how that starts to impact the other people in our lives. I think that's it. Yeah. Any last thoughts as we are wrapping up here?
I've got a lot to think about.
Okay.
I need to set up myself up a daily reminder that says check in with yourself or something like that. Maybe that's to go to attach with myself. We'll see if it works.
Yeah. I know for me, this last week, I've been dealing with, all my family of origin, my siblings, my parents are both passed away, but we've been dealing with something with one of our brothers, and it was so easy to fall into old patterns. And we know how to respond in those moments. And we're not even aware that we're responding. And I think my younger sister's husband said to her, like on day 3 of this, he said, you guys are handling this so well. Like, I would not even know where to start. And she had shared that with me. And she's like, we are handling it so well. And I said, right, we've been doing this since we were kids. Like, we just know, and I said, I don't know that any of our spouses can fully appreciate that knowledge we have in our body and how it can just kick in when we need it to. And I know for me, that kept me from connecting a lot of times growing up. It wasn't unusual. My husband happened to be out of town for work all week. But when he got home and then I got home from work on Friday, he just kind of looked at me and he came over and he just hugged me. And that was never an option for me before. And I just let him, I just kind of melted into that embrace. And I mean, I had been sharing with him throughout the week through text and phone calls what was happening and what was going on. But just to be able to have him just come and hold me, that was never an option before when I was having to go into that mode.
Yeah, it's amazing how powerful that is too.
Yeah.
And what you are saying is so foreign to me. I wouldn't even know
Right.
what that's like.
Yeah. I mean, it was foreign to me at one point too. And, you know, my younger self planned to always live on my own because that was the only way I thought I could be safe.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. For those of you who have Easter plans, hope those go well. And we will see each other next week.
Thanks so much. Have a good week, you
Thank
guys,
you.
and happy Easter.
Thanks. You guys too.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.